His ranch was dying, his horses were falling one by one, and the mail-order bride arriving that afternoon carried something hidden in her suitcase. But what did she know that Silas Drifter didn't? Drummer's weak cough echoed through the dark stable as Silas fell to his knees beside his oldest horse. Rain, sweat, and fear filled the air while 15 years of work stood on the edge of collapse. Then the train whistle brought a stranger with a secret she never mentioned. What was she hiding? Stay with us. The first sound Silas Drifter heard that morning was not the wind. It was a cough, a dry, hollow cough coming from the stable. Silas opened his eyes before the second sound came. For a moment, he lay still in the darkness of his small ranch house, listening to the quiet that surrounded him. The Texas hill country was usually never completely silent. There was always something moving outside. The cattle shifting in the pasture, the insects humming in the grass, the old wooden fence creaking when the night air cooled. But that morning, the ranch felt different. Wrong. Silas sat up, pulled on his boots and stepped onto the cold floorboards. He did not light a lamp. He knew the path from his bedroom to the back door without seeing it. 20 years on the same piece of land taught a man where every board complained and where every shadow fell. Outside, the sky was still dark blue before sunrise. The summer heat had not yet arrived, but the air already felt heavy. Silas crossed the yard quickly, his bare hands closing around the stable door. The old wooden door hung unevenly from its hinges. He had meant to fix it before the next rain, but there was always something else waiting. A broken fence post, a sick calf, a delivery to town. Another problem that needed solving before the things he ignored became impossible to avoid. Inside, the smell reached him before his eyes adjusted. Something was wrong. Silas stepped forward. "Drummer?" His voice was low, almost afraid to speak louder. The old stallion lay on his side. Silas stopped. That alone told him how serious it was. Drummer had never been a horse that surrendered easily. For 20 years, the animal had stood tall through storms, long rides, and hard seasons. He had followed Silas from the day he was a young colt, always pushing his nose against Silas's shoulder, always expecting a scratch between the ears. Now he could barely lift his head. Silas rushed forward and placed a hand against the horse's neck. The heat beneath his palm made his stomach tighten. "Easy, old friend." Drummer did not answer. Silas moved quickly through the stable. 8 horses were already down. 8. Some breathed too fast. Others barely moved. Their eyes were dull, their coats damp with sweat. The sound of weak breathing filled the wooden building. Bella, the young mare he had hoped to sell as part of his next breeding line, remained standing in the corner. But her legs shook so badly that the stall boards rattled beneath her hooves. Cooper, the chestnut gelding, stood with his head pressed against the wall. The water bucket beside him remained untouched. Silas walked back outside and stood beneath the fading stars. He looked across the empty pasture. 15 horses had carried this ranch on their backs. 15 animals he had raised, trained, and protected. Now, before sunrise, he was counting how many he might lose. 3 days earlier, Doc Harmon had walked through this same stable. The old doctor had spent nearly an hour checking temperatures, examining the animals, and studying the feed room. When he finally stepped outside, he removed his hat and stared toward the hills. Silas remembered every word. "I have seen sickness in animals for 40 years, Doc Harmon had said. "I have treated horses in army camps and cattle in winter storms." The old man had looked back at the stable. "But this one, I do not know what I am looking at." Silas had waited for another answer. There had not been one. The stage company was coming in 12 days to inspect his horses. One contract could keep the ranch alive through another year. Without it, the banknote on his equipment, the feed bills, and the repairs he had delayed would become impossible to manage. And now, the horses were dying. Silas walked back into the house and reached for the letter sitting beside his coffee cup. The paper was worn at the edges because he had opened it so many times. Dear Mr. Drifter, I accept your proposal. I will arrive on the 2:15 train from Kansas City on the 14th of July. I am not a fancy woman. I do not require fancy things. I can cook and clean and keep a house in order. I hope that will be enough. Respectfully, Grace Sullivan. Silas folded the letter carefully. Grace Sullivan would arrive in town that afternoon. She was coming to marry a man she had never met, a man she believed owned a working ranch, a man who, only hours earlier, had watched his oldest horse collapse in the straw. For a moment, Silas considered riding to Mercy Crossing and telling her not to come. He could give her enough money for a room and a ticket back east. She deserved the truth, but he had not even met her yet. He could not decide her future before she had the chance to choose it herself. So he returned to the stable and waited. By afternoon, the Texas sun had turned the dirt roads white with heat. Silas stood on the platform at Mercy Crossing wearing the cleanest shirt he owned. His boots were polished, his beard was trimmed. He looked like a man preparing for a new beginning. Only his tired eyes told the truth. The train whistle sounded in the distance. A cloud of dust rose beyond the tracks. The train rolled into the station with a long hiss of steam. People stepped down carrying bags, parcels, and small pieces of their lives. Then Silas saw her. Grace Sullivan stood at the bottom step holding a worn leather valise. She was dressed simply, with a brown dress carefully pressed, despite the long journey. A few strands of hair had escaped from beneath her pins. Her face showed exhaustion, but her posture remained steady. She looked at the town, then at him. Mr. Drifter? Silas nodded. Miss Sullivan? Yes. Her voice was quiet, but there was no uncertainty in it. Silas reached for her valise. The weight surprised him. It was far heavier than clothing should have been. Grace noticed his reaction. Her hand remained on the handle for one extra second before she let go. Whatever was inside that case mattered. Silas did not ask. Not yet. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet. Grace watched the landscape pass slowly. The dry creek beds, the cedar trees, the open hills, the empty pasture. She noticed the way Silas held the reins too tightly. She noticed the way his eyes kept returning toward the ranch buildings in the distance. You have many horses? She asked. Silas paused. I had 15 this morning. Grace turned toward him. The answer was strange, but she did not ask again. When they reached the ranch house, she immediately felt the loneliness inside it. A shawl hung beside the door, untouched. One chair at the table looked as though nobody had sat there in years. Dust rested on the shelves. A Bible sat near the window with its pages closed. This was not a home waiting for a bride. It was a place that had stopped moving after losing someone. Silas showed her the bedroom. You can have this room, he said. I'll stay near the stable. Grace studied him. The arrangement they had made through letters had been simple. Marriage. A home. A future. But standing there, she saw a man who looked like he was not sure he still had any of those things left. That night, after Silas returned to the stable, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table. The weak cough from outside reached through the open window. Then another. She stood slowly. The smell came next, sweet, sour, like something spoiled. Grace walked to her valise and opened it. Beneath her dresses were small glass bottles wrapped carefully in cloth. Bundles of dried herbs, clean linen strips, wooden measuring spoons, and beneath them all was a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. She touched the cover gently. Her grandmother's handwriting was still visible on the first page. Ruth Sullivan. Years of knowledge. Years of notes. Years of caring for animals that others had already given up on. Grace carried the book and an oil lamp toward the stable. Inside, Drummer barely moved. She knelt beside him. She checked his breathing, his gums, his temperature. Then she walked into the feed room. A torn section of the roof above the grain storage had allowed water inside. The feed was damp. Dark spots spread through the grain. Grace stared at it quietly. She already knew. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned. Silas stood in the doorway. His eyes moved from the sick horses to the book in her hands. Grace held his gaze. "I know what is hurting them," she said. Silas looked toward Drummer lying in the straw, then back at the woman he had expected to send away. "What do you mean?" Grace closed the book slowly. "I mean your horses may still have a chance." For the first time that day, Silas Drifter felt something more frightening than losing the ranch. Hope. Because hope meant there was something left to lose. He stood in the stable doorway, staring at Grace Sullivan and the old leather book in her hands. The lantern beside her flickered softly, throwing shadows across the wooden walls. Behind her, Drummer breathed weakly in the straw. The other horses shifted uneasily in their stalls. Silas looked at the woman who had arrived only hours earlier. A stranger, a woman he had promised to marry. A woman who now stood in his stable speaking with more confidence about his horses than the men who had spent their entire lives around them. "What makes you think you know what this is?" Silas asked. Grace did not answer quickly. She closed Ruth Sullivan's book and placed it carefully on a wooden crate. "Because I have seen it before." Silas glanced toward the sick horses. "Where?" "Pennsylvania." He looked back at her. "My grandmother treated animals for years. Horses, cows, farm dogs. She watched them closely. She believed animals always told you what was wrong if you were patient enough to listen." Silas rubbed his tired hand across his face. "Miss Sullivan, Doc Harmon has been caring for animals longer than I have been alive." "I know." "And he could not name this sickness." Grace nodded. "That does not mean it cannot be understood." The words were calm, not challenging, not disrespectful, but they still struck Silas harder than he expected. He had spent 3 days hearing people tell him there was nothing to do. Now this woman, standing in his stable after traveling halfway across the country, was telling him there might still be something. Silas looked toward Drummer. The old stallion's eyes opened slightly, then closed again. "What would you do?" Grace stepped closer to the feed room. "First, I would remove anything that might have made them sick." She pointed toward the damaged grain. "This feed has been wet. It should not be here." Silas looked at the bags stacked against the wall. "I bought that feed 2 weeks ago." "Then something changed after you bought it." Grace walked toward the nearest water bucket. "These need cleaning. The sick horses need fresh water more often, but only small amounts at a time." Silas watched her. She spoke like someone who had done this before, not someone guessing. "What else?" Grace looked at the horses. "Lower the heat where we can. Keep them separated. Watch their breathing. Watch their eyes. Watch how they stand." Silas was quiet. "You make it sound simple." "No," Grace said softly. "I make it sound possible." The stable went silent. For a moment, Silas almost believed her. Then fear returned. "What if you are wrong?" Grace met his eyes. "Then we will know we tried." Silas looked away. Trying was not enough to him. Not when the animals in those stalls represented everything he had left. The next morning, Grace found him already outside. The sun had barely risen, but Silas had already moved half the spoiled grain away from the feed room. He had not told her he would help. He simply started. Grace noticed. She also noticed he still looked uncertain. Inside she prepared coffee while Silas stood near the doorway, watching her organize the small supplies she had brought. "Your grandmother taught you all this?" he asked. Grace nodded. "She did." "She was a doctor?" Grace paused. She was a healer. Silas looked down at his coffee cup. Those are different things. Grace understood what he'd meant. My grandmother helped people who could not afford doctors. She helped farmers who had nowhere else to go. She helped animals because she believed every living thing deserved care. Silas did not answer. Grace continued quietly. Some people thanked her. Some people only came to her when they had no other choice. The room became still. Silas looked toward the window. Outside, Drummer gave a weak sound from the stable. "You should understand something," he said. Grace waited. "My horses are not just animals. I know. They are my work, my name, my future." Grace nodded. "And that is why I am trying to help them." Silas stared at her. Then he said the words that would hurt more than he intended. "I sent for a wife, Miss Sullivan, not someone carrying a book full of old stories." The coffee pot stopped steaming. Grace did not move. For a second, Silas wished he could pull the words back, but pride kept him standing. Grace lowered her eyes and carefully placed the cup she was holding on the table. "You are right about one thing," she said. Silas looked at her. I did come here because of your letter." She picked up the dishcloth beside the sink. "But I did not come here expecting you to believe me immediately." Her voice remained steady. "I only hoped you would listen." The cloth slipped slightly in her hand. Just once. Then she folded it neatly. Silas walked outside before he had to see the disappointment on her face. An hour later, a rider appeared at the ranch gate. Silas recognized the horse before the man even reached the house. Amos Vale, the wealthy breeder from the eastern side of the valley. Amos removed his hat as he approached. "Silas." Silas stepped onto the porch. "Amos." "I heard about the horses." Silas's expression hardened. "News travels fast." "Bad news always does." Amos glanced toward the stable. "I thought I might help." Silas almost laughed. Amos had never offered help without wanting something in return. "What kind of help?" The older man looked toward the pasture. "You know I have buyers looking for good stock. If things get worse, I could take some of those mares off your hands, save you from losing everything." Silas said nothing. Then Amos noticed Grace walking from the stable carrying a basket of supplies. His eyes moved from the herbs to the bottles inside. "And what is this?" Silas followed his gaze. "Her medicine." Amos raised an eyebrow. "You letting a woman experiment on registered horses?" Grace stopped walking. She heard him. Silas opened his mouth, but the answer did not come quickly enough. That hesitation hurt more than Amos's words. Grace lowered the basket slightly. Amos smiled. "I suppose desperate men do desperate things." Silas stepped forward. "You have said enough." Amos looked surprised, but Silas's voice remained controlled. "Leave my property." Amos put his hat back on. "Just remember, Silas, when those horses are gone, people will remember who was willing to buy." He turned his horse toward the road. Grace watched him disappear into the dust. Then she looked at Silas. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say he had not agreed with Amos, but wanting was not the same as speaking. That afternoon, Bella fell. The sound reached Silas before Grace did, a sharp, frightened cry from the stable. They ran. Bella was on the ground, her legs trembling. Silas dropped beside her. "No, girl." His hands moved over her neck. "Come on." Grace knelt beside him. Together they worked. Cool cloths, water, medicine, quiet voices. But Bella had already grown too weak. Silas stayed beside her until the movement stopped. The ranch became silent. Not peaceful silence, the kind that followed a loss. Silas buried Bella beneath the old live oak near the pasture. Grace watched from a distance. Each shovel of dirt sounded heavier than the one before. That night, Silas remained beside the grave. Grace returned to the house. She opened her valise, 2 dresses, Ruth's book, a small amount of money. Enough for a room at Hattie Bell's boarding house in Mercy Crossing. She folded everything carefully. Then she heard it. Drummer. A weak cough. Grace closed her eyes. She looked toward the window, then toward the valise. For several minutes, she stood between leaving and staying. Finally, she lifted the valise, not to carry it away, only to move it aside. Before sunrise, Grace walked into the stable. Silas was still outside beneath the oak. He did not see her begin. She removed the spoiled grain, scrubbed the water buckets, opened the stalls for fresh air. Then she rode toward Willow Creek alone with a small basket tied to her saddle. The Texas land was unfamiliar, but sickness was not. By noon, she returned with willow bark, peppermint, chamomile, and yarrow. She opened Ruth's book, measured carefully, recorded every change. Cooper was the first she treated, then the others strong enough to swallow. Finally, she reached Drummer. The old stallion could barely lift his head. Grace knelt beside him. "Come on," she whispered. She placed his head gently across her lap and tried to give him the medicine. A few drops spilled. His eyes remained closed. Grace looked down at him. Then she began to sing. It was the same quiet Irish lullaby Ruth had sung years before. A song meant for frightened creatures. A song meant to remind them they were not alone. Drummer's ear moved. Grace stopped breathing for a moment. Then his throat moved. Once. Then again. He swallowed. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Silas stood in the doorway holding a lantern. He looked at Grace, at Drummer, at the book beside her. For the first time, he did not see a stranger trying to change his ranch. He saw someone fighting beside him. Silas stepped forward. He said nothing. He simply placed the lantern closer and helped hold Drummer's head steady. Together they stayed there until the first light of morning reached beneath the stable door. But when Grace stepped outside later, she noticed something lying near the water barrel. The barrel was overturned. The clean water was gone, and fresh hoofprints led away toward Amos Vale's land. Silas stood beside the overturned barrel for a long moment. The morning sun climbed higher over the Texas hills, turning the wet dirt around the barrel into dark patches of mud. The rest of the ranch was waking slowly. Birds moved through the cedar trees. The horses shifted inside the stable. But Silas heard only one thing. Someone had come onto his land. Someone had seen his weakness, and someone had decided to make it worse. Grace stood beside him holding the empty water bucket. Her expression remained calm, but Silas noticed the way her fingers tightened around the handle. "I will find out who did this," he said. Grace looked toward the hoofprints. "And when you do?" Silas did not answer immediately, because he knew what she was really asking. Would he defend her? Would he defend the work she was doing? Or would he stay silent again? Before he could respond, Silas walked toward the lower pasture, where the tracks disappeared into the grass. He followed them for nearly half a mile before finding a rider waiting near the creek. Cal Pike, Amos Vale's hired hand. Cal looked uncomfortable when Silas approached. "Morning, Silas." Silas stopped his horse. "Did you come onto my property last night?" Cal looked away. "That was answer enough. You were told not to come near my ranch." "I was only looking around." Silas's jaw tightened. "Looking around?" Cal shrugged. Amos wanted to know how many horses were still standing. Silas stared at him. "You spilled my water." "It was an accident." Silas looked back toward the ranch. An accident. That was what men called things when they did not want to admit they caused harm. Cal shifted in his saddle. "You should sell before it gets worse." Silas moved closer. "My horses are not yours to count." Cal looked past him toward the ranch house. "Neither is that woman's future, if you ask me." Silas's expression changed. "Careful." Cal gave a small smile. I'm just saying what everyone in town is thinking. Silas reached up and grabbed the reins of Cal's horse. Not violently, not angrily, just firmly enough to make his point. Then everyone in town can learn to think somewhere else. Cal pulled away. Silas released the reins. Do not come back. Cal turned and rode away. Silas watched until the dust disappeared. Then he returned to the ranch. Grace was waiting near the kitchen door. She had seen enough to understand. You found him, Silas nodded. Cal Pike. And Amos? Silas looked down. Cal said Amos sent him. Grace was quiet. The wind moved through the grass between them. Then Silas said the words he should have said the day before. I was wrong. Grace looked up. Silas removed his hat. I should have listened. She said nothing. I was afraid, he continued. And I took that fear out on you. The honesty surprised her. Not because she thought he was incapable of apologizing. Because she had not expected him to do it before the horses recovered. Grace folded her arms. An apology after success is easy. Silas nodded. Drummer is still sick. The ranch is still in trouble. Amos is still trying to take advantage of it. He looked directly at her. So I am saying it now. Grace studied his face. For the first time since arriving, she saw a man who was not hiding behind silence. She did not smile, not yet, but she nodded. I need more medicine. Silas looked toward the hills. Where? Willow Creek. That is 2 hours by horse. Yes. And the trail is rough. Yes. Silas walked toward the barn. I'll saddle another horse. Grace watched him. You do not have to. Silas stopped. I know. That answer stayed with her, because he was not helping out of obligation. He was choosing to. The trail to Willow Creek wound through dry valleys and low cedar-covered ridges. The morning heat pressed down on them, but the farther they rode, the quieter the land became. Grace studied every plant along the trail. Silas noticed. You see things most people miss. Grace looked over. My grandmother taught me that people often look without noticing. They reached the creek just before noon. The water moved slowly between the rocks, clear and cool beneath the shade of the trees. Grace knelt beside a willow. This is what we need. She showed him how to remove bark carefully. Silas tried. Too much came away. Grace reached over and took the knife from his hand. You are trying to win a fight with a tree. Silas looked at the damaged branch. I have never been accused of being patient. A small smile appeared on Grace's face. Notice that. Silas looked at her, and then something unexpected happened. Grace laughed, only for a moment, softly. But it was real. The sound surprised both of them. Silas had heard the quiet voice, the careful answers, the polite distance. But he had not heard joy from her. You should do that more, he said. Grace lowered her eyes. Do what? Laugh. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Grace turned back toward the willow trees. They gathered the medicine in silence. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of strangers, the silence of two people beginning to understand each other. On the ride back, Grace finally spoke. My grandmother died during winter. Silas looked ahead. What happened? She was sick. I knew what to do, but knowing is not the same as saving. Silas was quiet. Then he said, My wife died the same way. Grace looked at him. Eleanor? He nodded. She got sick during the cold season. The roads froze. I rode for help, but the doctor arrived too late. The horses continued walking. The hills stretched around them. Grace looked down at the basket of herbs. My grandmother used to say knowledge does not promise victory. Silas listened. It only tells you where to place your hands while there is still hope. The words stayed between them. That afternoon, the stable changed. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Grace checked each horse. Silas carried water. She measured medicine. He cleaned stalls. She recorded symptoms in Ruth's old book. He began keeping notes beside hers. They worked without needing to explain every movement. Then, 8 days after the sickness began, Cooper moved. At first, Silas thought he imagined it. The chestnut gelding shifted in the straw, then slowly pushed upward. His legs shook. Grace stepped forward. Easy. Silas froze. Cooper stood. Not strongly, not perfectly, but he stood. Silas reached toward the horse, then stopped. Grace took his hand and placed it against Cooper's neck. The warmth beneath his palm was different. The fever was breaking. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Grace was watching him. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Later that afternoon, Doc Harmon arrived after receiving Silas's message. The old doctor examined Cooper carefully. He looked through Grace's notes. He checked the feed room. He studied the water barrels. Finally, he turned toward Silas. "I believe Miss Sullivan was right." Grace looked down. Doc Harmon continued. "The care, the cleaning, the medicine, the timing. It all matters." He looked at Ruth's book. Whoever wrote these notes understood animals. Grace touched the cover gently. "My grandmother." Doc Harmon nodded. "She deserves to be remembered." For the first time, someone outside Grace's family said those words. The ranch began to breathe again. Another horse drank. Another lifted its head. The stable slowly filled with sounds that had disappeared. Hooves moving, hay being pulled, soft nickers in the morning air. But Drummer remained in the straw. Silas watched him every night. Grace noticed. "You do not celebrate the others." Silas looked at Drummer. "They are important." She waited. "But he is different." Grace understood. Some animals carried memories. Some carried pieces of a person's past. That evening, another letter arrived, from Hattie Bell in Mercy Crossing. Grace read it quietly. A room was available, work was available, a place where she could begin again. She folded the letter and placed it inside Ruth's book. Silas did not see, not yet. Later he found Grace asleep at the kitchen table. The book was beside her. Eleanor's old shawl hung over the back of the chair. Silas picked it up carefully and placed it over Grace's shoulders. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked away. The next morning, the sky changed. Dark clouds gathered over the western hills. The horses became restless before the wind arrived. Silas looked toward the stable roof. 2 beams were still weak. Grace followed his eyes. "Drummer cannot take another cold night." Silas nodded. They began carrying boards toward the stable. Neither noticed the folded letter from Hattie slip from Ruth's book and fall near the doorway, until Silas picked it up, until he read the first line, and until he realized Grace had already planned a life beyond his ranch. Silas stood near the stable doorway, holding Hattie Bell's letter in his hand. The paper felt heavier than it should have. He had read only a few words. A room was available in Mercy Crossing. Work was available. A place for Grace to begin again. He looked toward the house. Through the window, he could see her moving between the kitchen and the hallway, unaware that he had found the letter. For a moment, Silas thought about walking inside and asking her, "Why didn't you tell me? Why were you preparing to leave?" But then he remembered the way he had spoken to her when she first arrived. The way he had made her feel like a stranger in a place where she had traveled thousands of miles to belong. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside Ruth's book. He would not question her before he had earned the right to hear the answer. Outside, the wind began to change. The Texas evening that had been warm and still suddenly felt different. The horses noticed first. Drummer lifted his head slightly from the straw. Cooper shifted uneasily. The younger horses moved closer together. Grace stepped out onto the porch. "Storm?" Silas looked toward the western horizon. A wall of dark clouds was rising beyond the hills. "Fast one." They both knew what that meant. The stable roof was not ready. 2 beams near Drummer's stall still needed replacing. Silas had planned to repair them after the herd recovered. Now there was no time. They worked until sunset. Silas carried boards from the storage shed. Grace gathered blankets, medicine bottles, and clean cloth. The first thunder rolled across the valley while they were still inside the stable. Drummer watched them quietly. Grace rested a hand against his neck. "You hear that?" The horse blinked slowly. "We are trying." Silas stood nearby holding the lantern. He watched her speak to the horse like he was a member of the family, not property, not a valuable animal, a life. The first drops of rain hit the roof just after dark. Then the sky opened. Wind slammed into the ranch. The stable doors shook against their hinges. Silas moved quickly to secure the latch, but another gust tore one side open again. The horses panicked. Wood creaked. Hooves struck against the stalls. Lightning flashed across the windows, turning the stable white for one brief second. Grace grabbed a rope. "Silas!" He looked toward the roof. The old beams were moving. "I know." They pushed the stronger horses toward the safer side of the stable while rain poured through the gaps above them. Then came a sound neither of them wanted to hear. A sharp crack. One of the roof supports split. A section of the roof collapsed above Drummer's stall. Cold rain poured directly onto him. The old stallion tried to rise. His legs shook. Silas dropped beside him. "No, no, easy." Grace rushed forward. "We need to move him." Together they pulled blankets beneath him and dragged him away from the falling water. Another crash sounded above them. Silas looked up. A loose section of the roof was about to fall toward the main aisle. "I'll secure it." Grace grabbed his arm. "Silas, it has to be done." Before she could answer, he climbed onto the lower beam with a rope tied around his waist. The wind pushed against him. Rain soaked his shirt. For one moment, Grace saw the same stubbornness that had kept this ranch alive for years, the same stubbornness that had nearly destroyed him. "Silas!" The board beneath his boots snapped. Everything happened quickly. The rope pulled tight. Silas fell hard against the loft edge. Grace grabbed the rope with both hands and wrapped it around a wooden post. The weight nearly pulled her forward, but she held on. "Do not move!" Silas looked down at her. For the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself, for him. He climbed down slowly. His shoulder was bruised, but he ignored it, because Drummer had started shaking. The horse's body tightened. His breathing changed. Silas dropped beside him. "Drummer." The stallion struggled for air. Then suddenly, everything became still. Silas placed his hand against Drummer's neck. Nothing. The storm continued outside, but inside the stable there was a silence deeper than thunder. Silas lowered his head. For years he had carried loss quietly. His mother, his wife, the people and animals that had disappeared from his life one by one. Now he whispered the fear he had never admitted. "Everything I love leaves." Grace knelt beside him. She checked Drummer carefully. Then she felt something. A faint movement. A pulse. "Silas." He looked up. "He is still here." Silas stared at her. "I cannot feel anything." "Because you are expecting goodbye." Her voice was gentle. "Do not bury him while he is still fighting." Silas looked at Drummer, then at Grace. "What do you need?" She hesitated, then answered honestly, "I cannot do this alone." The words changed something, because before that moment, Silas had spent his whole life believing needing help was the same as weakness. Now he simply nodded. Tell me where to put my hands." They moved Drummer onto dry straw. Silas lit the small iron stove in the corner. Grace prepared medicine. He held the lantern. She measured every drop. He counted the minutes. She checked Drummer's breathing. The storm raged outside for hours, but inside the stable they worked together. No arguments, no pride. Only two people trying to save one life. During a brief quiet moment between thunder, Silas looked at Grace. The letter. She knew immediately. "Hattie's?" He nodded. "I saw it." Grace looked down. "I was going to leave after the horses were safe." Silas swallowed. "Because of what I said?" "Partly." She adjusted the blanket over Drummer. "But mostly because I was afraid." "Of what?" Grace was quiet for a long time. Then she answered, "That once the ranch was saved, you would no longer need me." Silas looked at her. Grace continued, "My whole life, I have seen people value what I can do before they value who I am." The rain tapped against the broken roof. "When I came here, I thought maybe if I became useful enough, I would finally have a place." Silas looked away. The words hurt because he understood them. He had done the same thing. He had built a life around being useful, fixing fences, training horses, working until exhaustion kept memories away. "I sent for a wife," he said quietly. Grace looked at him. "But I think I was really searching for someone to fill the silence." He looked toward Drummer. "I forgot a person cannot be used to repair an empty place." Grace said nothing. Silas continued, "I do not want you to stay because you saved my ranch." A pause. "I do not want you to stay because of a letter." Another pause. "I want you to choose." The storm began to weaken. The wind faded. The rain softened. Near dawn, Drummer's breathing became quieter, then weaker. Grace checked him again. Her expression changed. Silas saw it. "What is it?" She did not answer. She checked once more. The stable grew still. Water dripped from the broken roof. One drop, then another. Grace began singing softly, the same lullaby Ruth had taught her. Not because she expected a miracle, because sometimes a creature should not face the dark alone. Silas removed his hat. He lowered his eyes. Then a small sound came from the straw. Grace stopped. Drummer's ear moved. Silas looked up. The old stallion opened his eyes. Slowly, carefully. He took one deep breath, then another. Silas reached forward. Drummer turned his head and touched his hand. For the first time in days, Silas smiled. Not because the ranch was saved, not because the contract might return, because the horse who had carried his memories had chosen to stay. Outside, the first light of morning broke over the Texas hills. The storm had passed, but the hardest truth still remained. Grace was free to leave, and Silas knew he had to let her choose. Later that morning, Doc Harmon arrived with 2 stage company buyers behind him. They expected to find a ruined ranch. Instead, they found Cooper standing. They found other horses drinking. They found Drummer alive. Doc Harmon examined the feed, Grace's notes, and the recovering herd. Then he turned toward the visitors. "This woman found what we missed." Amos Vale, standing behind them, shook his head. "Luck." Silas looked at Grace, then at Amos. "No." His voice carried across the stable. "Not luck." He stepped beside her. "This ranch is standing because Grace Sullivan refused to walk away when everyone else had." For once, Silas did not stay silent. That evening, after everyone left, he placed 2 things on the kitchen table: Grace's original marriage letter and a small envelope containing money for the train. Beside it was a signed paper releasing her from every promise made before she arrived. Silas stood quietly. "When you decide what comes next," he said, "I need to know it is your choice." Then he walked back toward the stable, leaving Grace alone with the answer. For a long time, Grace did not move. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock above the doorway. Morning sunlight came through the window, touching the edge of the envelope on the table. Train fare, a signed release. Freedom. She had crossed half a country because of a letter that promised a future with a man she had never met. Now that same man had placed the choice back into her hands. No conditions, no demands, no expectation. Grace picked up the paper. The words were simple. She owed Silas Drifter no marriage, no labor, no debt. Nothing. Her belongings remained hers. If she wished to leave, he would make sure she had a safe journey. Grace read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it beside Ruth's book. Outside, she heard hammering. Silas was repairing the stable, not waiting for her answer, not standing at the window hoping she would choose him. Just working. That was what made the decision harder, because for the first time in her life, someone had offered her a door and did not stand in front of it. The next morning, Grace walked to the stable. The damage from the storm was still visible. Broken boards leaned against the fence. The roof needed more repairs. The ground was soft from rain, but the horses were alive. Cooper stood near the pasture gate. 2 other horses grazed slowly nearby, and Drummer, though thinner and weaker than before, lifted his head when Silas approached. Grace watched from a distance. She saw the way Silas rested a hand on the old stallion's neck. No words, no performance, just gratitude. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch slowly returned to itself. Not quickly, not like some impossible miracle. One horse stood, then another. Some days were better than others. Some mornings brought worry. Some evenings brought relief. Silas repaired the stable roof board by board. He replaced the broken fence posts near the northern pasture. He fixed the porch railing that had leaned dangerously for months. Things that had been ignored during his grief slowly found their way back. Grace noticed something else. Silas no longer worked as if he was running from something. He worked as if he was building towards something. She continued treating the horses and recording every change in Ruth's old book. Neighbors began arriving at the ranch. First came Widow Carter with a cow that had stopped eating. Then old Murphy brought a weak calf that barely wanted to stand. They came carefully. Some carried doubt. Others carried hope. Grace never promised what she could not give. She examined each animal. She listened. She worked. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she had to tell people there was nothing more to be done. And each time Silas stood beside her. Never speaking for her. Never taking credit. Just standing. One afternoon, Doc Harmon visited while Grace was writing notes in the medicine book. He looked through the pages carefully. "These observations," he said. "Your grandmother wrote them." Grace nodded. She did. The old doctor closed the book gently. She understood things people spend their whole lives learning. Grace looked at the cover. Most people never knew her name. Doc Harmon looked at her. Then maybe it is time they did. Grace said nothing, but she touched the book a little more carefully after that. A few days later, Hattie Bell arrived from Mercy Crossing in a small wagon. Grace hugged her warmly. The 2 women sat on the porch drinking coffee while Silas repaired a gate nearby. Hattie looked around the ranch. "I expected you to be gone by now." Grace smiled faintly. "So did I." Hattie followed her eyes toward Silas. "He treats you well?" Grace was quiet. Then she answered honestly. "He is learning." Hattie smiled. "That is sometimes worth more than a man who thinks he already knows everything." Grace laughed softly. The sound carried across the yard. Silas looked up from the fence. For a moment, he simply watched her. Then he returned to his work. Later that afternoon, another rider arrived. Amos Vale. He stopped near the gate. This time he was alone. "I heard you have quite a reputation now," he said to Grace. She stood near the porch steps. "What do you need, Mr. Vale?" Amos looked toward the stable. I have a large operation. More animals than this place could ever handle. Silas stopped working, but he did not walk over. He waited. Amos continued. I could use someone with your skills. Grace studied him. The old version of herself might have listened carefully. A better paying position, a larger ranch, a chance to prove herself. But she remembered the way Amos had looked at her when she first arrived, like her knowledge had no value until it became useful to him. No, she said. Amos looked surprised. You should think carefully. I have. She stepped closer. A person cannot disrespect someone's work and then expect trust when they need it. Amos looked toward Silas. Silas said nothing. He did not need to. Grace had answered for herself. Amos rode away. That evening, Silas asked Grace to follow him. I want to show you something. They walked around the side of the house toward a small wooden building she had assumed was another storage shed. Silas opened the door. Grace stopped. Inside was a room she had never seen before. The walls had been cleaned and painted. Shelves lined both sides. A workbench sat beneath a wide window where the afternoon light poured in. There were hooks for drying herbs, a basin for washing tools, a cabinet for supplies, a place for records, a place for her work. Grace slowly stepped inside. Then she noticed the words carved beneath the largest shelf. Ruth Sullivan's Remedies. Her hand moved over the letters. For a moment, she could not speak. Silas stood near the doorway. I thought your grandmother's work deserved a place. Grace looked back at him. Why? Silas took a slow breath. Because it was yours before it ever helped me. The answer stayed with her. He reached into his pocket and placed a small key on the table. This belongs to you. Grace looked at the key. Even if I leave? Silas nodded. Even then. She looked at him carefully. Why would you build something for someone who might walk away? Silas looked toward the window. Because loving someone does not mean closing the door behind them. The room became quiet. Grace reached into her dress pocket. She pulled out her copy of the original marriage letter. The one that had brought her here. The one that had started everything. Silas watched as she unfolded it. Then she tore it in half. His expression changed. For a moment, he thought she was saying goodbye. But Grace placed the pieces beside Ruth's book. I do not want to marry you because two lonely people signed a paper. Silas remained silent. Grace stepped closer. I want to know if you would choose me without that letter. The question was not a demand. It was a chance. Silas looked at the woman who had walked into his broken ranch carrying nothing but courage and a leather-bound book. Then he spoke. Grace Sullivan. His voice was quiet. Will you stay here because you choose this place? A pause. Because you choose your work? Another pause. And because you choose me? Grace smiled. But I keep my own name on that medicine room. Silas nodded. I expected nothing less. For the first time since she arrived, the future did not feel like something written on paper. It felt like something they were creating together. Their wedding took place beneath the old live oak tree several weeks later. Bella's grave and the other lost horses remained nearby. Not hidden. Not forgotten. Hattie Bell stood beside Grace. Doc Harmon stood beside Silas. Widow Carter, Old Murphy, and neighbors from across the valley gathered as the summer sun moved over the hills. Grace wore Ruth's small silver brooch. Silas made no promises of ownership, only partnership, only honesty, only a home where both of them belonged. Months later, the sign outside the small medicine room read, Grace Sullivan Drifter, Animal Care. The ranch continued. The horses grew stronger. Drummer followed Silas through the pasture like he had for 20 years, and Grace continued the work her grandmother began. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Texas hills. Grace closed the window of the medicine room. Silas waited on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. The horseshoe chime made from Drummer's old shoes moved softly in the breeze. Grace sat beside him. She placed her hand beneath his. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The ranch was quiet again. But this time, the silence was not the sound of something being lost. It was the sound of 2 people who had finally found where they belonged. And maybe that is what makes Silas and Grace's story stay with us. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with a gun or a sword. Sometimes they happen quietly inside a person's heart. The battle to trust again. The courage to open a door after years of keeping it closed. The strength to believe that love can arrive not as a rescue, but as a partnership. Imagine standing where Silas stood, watching everything you built begin to fall apart. Or imagine being Grace, carrying a lifetime of knowledge and wondering if anyone would ever see your worth beyond what you could provide. Their story reminds us that healing often begins when someone chooses to stay, not because they have to, but because they truly want to. If you were in Silas's place, would you have been able to trust Grace's wisdom when everything was at risk? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of second chances, quiet courage, and unforgettable journeys touch your heart, consider subscribing. More moving tales of love, mystery, and healing are waiting for you in the stories ahead.